Please pray with me before I offer a message this morning. Gracious, loving God, Lord of life and hope, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. At that very first Easter, when Mary, and Salome set out to visit these three women going to the tomb, there was a great obstacle that would await them. So they asked each other these words, this puzzling question: who will roll away the stone for us? The stone is something like what you see on the screen. It was the way of securing a tomb in those times. It was really the lock system for a tomb. And it was very, very heavy. It was meant to be difficult to roll away from the tomb. And so during that first Easter, these women had no idea how they would remove that obstacle, that door from the tomb where Jesus lay. They had brought spices, valuable spices that they had purchased themselves. These were ritual spices that they would bring to Jesus' body to observe the Jewish rituals of their time. But they had one thing that confused them. How would they roll the stone away? Yet miraculously, when they arrived, that had been done for them. They had already seen that this stone was rolled away. We could see how massive it would be. The three of them couldn't have done it. You couldn't do it with one person. An angel of God had to move that stone for them. And immediately they began to understand a miracle was taking place. We come to the tomb this morning, first thing in the morning, to see if this is true. If God can remove obstacles that we cannot remove in our own lives. If God can bring life where we see only death. We're invited to reflect on this. What is the obstacle that we think is impassable, impossible to remove? We're invited this morning to consider how God's help might move such obstacles. My favorite religious studies professor once was interviewed by someone who asked whether he believed in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He is a professor, Houston Smith, who has studied religions from around the world, and this skeptical interviewer said, now that you've studied all the religions of the world, now that you've studied and taught in universities, some of our nation's finest universities, do you believe in the resurrection? Do you believe that Jesus was raised from the dead? He admitted, he said, I find it a challenge to believe it. With a Western mind, with an Enlightenment background, the Western culture that trains us in the scientific method and Enlightenment thinking, it's very difficult to believe that. However, I do believe that God is so great that if God wanted to raise Jesus from the dead, he could do so, and easily. And this statement of faith rung throughout the lecture hall where he was being interviewed. All of this skeptical audience had to sit with that challenge. Do you believe that God could do it if God wanted to? Or are you willing to say that God, the creator of all things, could not do this? Houston Smith professed his faith that God can. God can bring life from death. God can remove immovable obstacles, or obstacles that we understand to be immovable. This belief has consequences. It has an impact for our lives as human beings, as Christians. Suddenly we think things are possible that we previously thought were not. I remember this lesson in very practical terms when I learned it in Chicago as I was working with young people on the Northwest Side. We had troubled youth who were sometimes in and out of jail, and we tried to create positive experiences for them. I was over my head most of the time trying to create those programs. We had a few of the adult counselors from that community that were trying to also support those youth. One of these was named Bob. Bob worked with me on planning, and one time we were working on what would come next for the youth program, and suddenly I realized all of these things cost money, and I said, Bob, we have to talk about fundraising. We shouldn't even put these events on the calendar until we have a source of funding, unless we know how we can raise the funds in this poor neighborhood. We don't want to promise anything we can't deliver. Bob began to shake his head and said, Pastor, that's not how we do things around here. He said, if we waited in all of our planning to begin anything until we had adequate funding to fund it, we would never start. We have to begin. And the way we do things around here is we get started not knowing how it will work. And God provides. Somehow the money comes. It works out. Enthusiasm builds. And great things happen. And truly great things did happen. We ended up taking youth for the first time in their lives out of that urban setting into retreat centers, to the forest. They were afraid at first to go to the forest. They were afraid of the animals. They'd never been out of the city, where they had, in my opinion, so much to fear. We were able to do these things because of the resurrection faith of leaders like Bob, who said, let's get started. Let's go to the tomb before we know how to open it. Let's show up. Let us love. Let us devote ourselves as these women devoted themselves to God, bringing their gifts to their beloved teacher, their friend, Jesus, carrying out those sacred rituals in God's name. Let us give our hearts to God and to one another. Let us show up not knowing what to do, but knowing we must go. What a powerful message for us that we dearly need in a world where there are many closed tombs and many worries and fears about how they may be opened. We face so many obstacles, so many of these doors that are difficult to even budge in our world today. We're disheartened this past week by a new clash between Israelis and Palestinians, where 15 Palestinians, at least 15, were killed. Who will roll away this stone that has remained so stuck in front of the tomb? How can life ever come out of this deadly situation? We cry out in despair to our God. And we mourn the death of another young black man, Stephon Clark, who was killed by police officers in Sacramento, California. How long, O Lord, before you roll away the stone of interracial violence in our country? Will we ever be finished with this seemingly endless story? We lament our brokenness. We lament our sin and the violence among us. We ask this question, who will roll away the stone? And we trust in God's help, in God's strength, in moving it. And in that spirit, like those women who came to the tomb, we continue to show up, to do our part, to love, to hope against hope that angels will help us with this work, until God once again brings life where we see only death. Amen. And of course, this morning we ponder the greatest obstacle we face, death itself, this mystery of life and death. Jesus' story brings us right to the opening of that greater story. That door which seems ultimately immovable and ultimately closed, the moment of death itself. It seems like that final, inescapable obstacle that we can never avoid or overcome. And yet in Jesus' resurrection, God's life overcomes death. It's like a great April Fool's joke, isn't it? When we were sure that this was the end, it was only another beginning for God. God says, ha ha, April Fools, the joke's on all of you. And thank God that it is. We laugh with joy. There are traditions in the church, and we will celebrate them in subsequent Sundays called Bright Sunday, where we laugh. This next week, Pastor Nicole will preach, but the following week, I will preach about that Bright Sunday message where we invite laughter and even joke-telling into the sanctuary to remind us that God has the last laugh over death and evil itself. Amen? So we gather together today to smile in the face of death, to remind ourselves that death is only a change, and remember the words of St. Paul to the Corinthians, where he says, I tell you a mystery, we will not all die, but we will all be changed. I encourage you to think of death in this way. We will be changed. It's not an end. It's a transition. It's a change. It's a big change. But it's only a change. It's a change we struggle to understand. I had the most wonderful conversation over lunch with one of our church leaders this past week, where she talked about the mystery of her own mother's death. This sacred moment when she was by her mother's side, even as her mother breathed her last breath. This church member shared with me that she was amazed by the experience because she knew her mother was going to die. She had been with her mother for some time, and all of the family expected that she would pass away rather soon. And yet, she said, when that moment came, it was overwhelming. The depth of sorrow, the grief, and the joy of her mother's life all mixed together. Her heart was overcome with these emotions. She had no control over it. It was bigger than her. And of course, we see as we talk about it, and we talked about it during that lunch, how it stands to reason, doesn't it, that our mind can't conceive of death itself, can't really understand what will happen. We won't have a mind like this one when we are in that moment, when we have passed away. We will change. We will change in ways that we cannot understand. We have to understand it with our heart. And doesn't our heart tell us that we will live on? Doesn't it feel right that we will continue to grow in God's love eternally? It doesn't make sense to me that it would all stop, that it will all end. I've made a lot of progress, hard-earned progress during this life. Perhaps you have too. You've worked hard to grow closer to God and grow in God's love. You've made a lot of mistakes, so have I. We've learned from those. It would be a really bad April Fool's joke if God tricked us, and I don't think God does. God honors that growth that we have, those learnings. I have every reason to believe that it continues on forevermore. I've met people who have died for a short while, and they've said, oh, yes, it does. Don't worry about it. It keeps going. Their heart stopped. Their breathing stopped. It kept going. It does keep going. This is what we proclaim. Though we don't understand with the head, we believe it in our hearts. Amen? This is resurrection faith that we come to practice this Easter morning and every day. Let us live in this way with those three women who go expectantly to the tomb, even in their time of grief. Let us not stop to think how insurmountable life's obstacles are. Let us not think ourselves into paralysis, fearing that the world's problems are too great for us to overcome. Let us simply show up. Let us love one another. Devote our hearts completely to God, to one another, and to all those neighbors we have yet to meet, so that we may watch and wonder as God's angels open doors that we never expected would be rolled away. May it be so. Amen.